Wait, you were in Berlin?
Yeah, I did my master thesis in Berlin.
At which one? The Mind and Brain? Or?
Mind and Brain, yeah.
Oh, I can't remember you doing that. Oh, okay. Who did you do your thesis with?
Nico Busch. I mean, I didn't do my master's in Berlin. I did my master's in Munich, but then I went, for half a year, I went to Berlin and did my master thesis with him.
Ah, okay, I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah. It's the time when I was still studying vision perception processes.
That stopped, though, once you did that project, or?
I don't actually know. Yeah, it stopped. I actually, my bachelor thesis was in visual perception. My master thesis was in visual perception. I worked as a HEVI in a visual perception lab. All I did, my entire pre-PhD academic training was focused on visual perception and alpha oscillations. And then I kind of stopped and moved to Hamburg and worked with Jan. I mean, Jan just needed someone who knew EEG, kind of, and I wanted to switch to a more computational approach.
Which doesn't exist in vision.
I mean, of course it does. No, I was just to be honest, when I started my PhD, it was kind of, I wasn't really sure whether I wanted to stay in academia. It all sounded very stressful. And so I took a break for a while, and I worked at the Freie Universität in Dahlem on I was just kind of like a long-term HEVI person and did programmed their experiments and ran 100 hours of recordings with kids. And then I figured, I'm doing this, I might as well get a PhD.
Get a degree for this.
Yeah, don't send that on the radio. I don't want people to know that I wasn't actually. No. I kind of switched fields completely. I thought it sounded interesting what Jan put in this ad, which actually ended up to be Leigh's thesis. So when I applied, the position was already taken, and so I was actually it was stressful and it was fun because Jan said, "Yeah, sure, you can come and you can pretty much do whatever you want," which sounded great. But then on the other hand, you're 20-something and you have no clue and you're completely new to the field. So can also be kind of daunting.
But yeah, okay, I didn't know that you did vision the entire time. But I guess you said that academia sounded stressful. I guess that turned out not to be the case at all, right? It's very relaxing.
Oh, yeah.
It's like at a spa every day.
It's a walk in the park. Yeah, no, I mean, it is stressful and we all know that. And all of us are struggling with that, I think. And everyone at some point in our career think about quitting maybe. I mean, there are certain things that are great about it and there are other things that are really hard and, difficult to deal with. And I think from what I've heard and what I feel myself, it's like people go through these oscillations in a way. Like sometimes they're really excited about it and then everything is just really tough and hard and you don't see any perspective. But I mean, I think for me, the biggest advantage of academia is it's I kind of like to hang out with these people. They're all slightly weird and have weird interests and very specific interests. And it's very hard to find a researcher that isn't fun to talk to.
But you can have the social interactions without having to work with them, right?
That's
you can
true,
just be friends
yeah.
with them. You don't need. Is this one big socializing program for you?
Yeah, that's true. But you spend a lot of time at work, don't you? And then imagine being in an office and you have all these colleagues that you don't get along with or you don't find interesting, and then you have to spend all your day with them.
Yeah. By the way, have you actually... So you've been in the US for a year now, right? More or less exactly, or...
Yeah, I started working here March 1st, 2020.
Okay, so we're recording this on the 22nd.
Yeah.
Actually, what was so a few questions about that. First is, have you actually seen anything of the US yet? Or have you just been at home for the last year
I've been at home a lot, like everyone else. I mean, we got here, and when we got here 2 weeks before the travel ban was instantiated. So we got here 2 weeks before we actually would have not been able to come here. And the funny thing though is at the time there was very few people and maybe 2-3 people on the plane were wearing masks, and it was still this thing in China. And officially there wasn't a single case, I think. in the US. I think also they had like the tests weren't working in the beginning or something. But so we got here and COVID wasn't a thing yet. And so it was just normal life. LA is very much defined by traffic, and it was very, very dense traffic. It was very hard to get to places. And so we actually, like, we managed to buy some furniture, which was nice because, and we already had a place when we moved here. So that was good. But, then I think I went to the office for about a week and a half, and then it started being like, okay, it's this weird thing going on. We don't really know when we'll be able to come back. So try to get all your belongings and clean out the fridge. And it started to become this really scary, daunting thing. And then they said, you can stay home if you want to. And I kind of decided to stay home because I was taking public transportation for about an hour one way. And, okay. I wasn't, and then people started to wear like garbage bags and all kinds of stuff to protect them. It was really weird.
Over their face or just as?
Yeah, of their entire body, essentially. Like they were wearing homemade hazmat suits. And then pretty soon, yeah, of course, yeah. So I'm still wearing one, as you obviously can see.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, Tessa is wearing just rubbish bags, bin bags right now.
Yeah. So that's when I started to stay home. And then 3 days later, actually on a Friday night, we got an email. It's like, go to the office, get everything you need. You will not be able to enter campus from Monday on. So we all, we went, made the schedule, and then we all went in and we grabbed our screens and our keyboards and emptied the fridge, and we all met in kind of a hurry. And we didn't really know what was going on, and we packed everything, and we had a rental car at the time, and so we packed everything in the car. Jonathan picked me up, and so we drove home, and then it started raining, which is a very weird thing in Southern California, and it started raining for about 2 weeks, very heavy rain. It was a pandemic. We were on lockdown. Everything was closed. And that was just the beginning. And we sat in our one-bedroom apartment. And it was, it was pretty scary, to be honest, in the beginning. And we didn't really know what was going on, and everything was closed. And the shops were empty. The shelves were completely empty, not just toilet paper, but anything that you could eat was gone from the shelves. And these gigantic lines in front of the grocery stores. And so it was just really, really weird. Yeah.
And you didn't know anyone there, or?
I didn't know. I mean, I knew the two people that used to live in my apartment, and I know, but the majority of my colleagues I hadn't met. I had met 3 or 4 people, and the majority of my colleagues I met over Zoom. And we started having these social Zooms with the lab, and we had very frequent lab meetings. And Ralph, so I'm with Ralph Adolphs and John O'Doherty, and Ralph started giving, we had to give presentations in our lab meeting about COVID, about the virus, about mitigation strategies, how it's going to affect different parts of the world. So we actually went through a really scientific process of processing it. Which was
so they're not as a project, just
no, just in the lab meeting, just the lab, and we kind of split up the topics, and it was just to get ourselves informed and know what's going on. And we were looking at the different predictions, at the different models, and actually I remember back at the time when we saw that, it was like, okay, we're gonna have a spike in spring here, and then if we go on lockdown and everyone stays home, we're gonna flatten the curve, which was this big thing on Twitter, right? Hashtag flatten the curve. And then what would happen is there's going to be this bigger, gigantic peak in November, October, something like that. I don't remember the exact date, but looking at this graph, it was like, oh, actually, it's not going to get any better anytime soon. And these were the models in March. And so we already knew, we could have all already known that it's going to be really bad in the fall, and that's what happened. It was exactly how it was predicted. And then, of course, it was also a strange time because it was still the prior administration, and it was there were a lot of questions about visas, and they started questioning whether students that are all online actually are going to lose their student visas because they don't actually have to be here. There was this travel ban. It was all these blockages of J1 visa, which all the scholars are on, or the majority of the scholars are on. And so we really just made it to the US because right after we came here, we wouldn't have been able to enter the country anymore. And a couple of people got stuck in Germany or in China. And so we had lab meetings. It was really hard to find a time for lab meetings sometimes because we had to cover China at all the way to Hawaii, which is a pretty big range. And that was sometimes hard. Yeah.
But did you want to come to the US then? Or were you a bit hesitant about doing it?
Well, when we left, it wasn't a thing. It was it was a thing, but it wasn't a thing in Europe and the Western world, I would say. And it was similar to when SARS or the swine flu was around, and we knew that there was something going on, or Ebola, which this was a really eye-opening time, I think, to some degree, because there have been several pandemics over the last decades. It was just we as Europeans or as US Americans or the northern Western world have not been that strongly affected by it. And that was it was weird how you empathized a little bit with China and with, they're all on lockdown and they're sitting in their homes and they can't leave the city. And then, actually we're affected too. And this is not something that can happen here. And I think for our generation, it's probably the first time we really experienced something that dramatic and traumatic, maybe. I mean, we haven't experienced any war in Europe. We haven't experienced major political crises. There have been economic crises, but it was never, I think for us, that was kind of the first time that we experienced something like that. I wonder whether our parents, maybe with Chernobyl, it was similar when they weren't able to leave or eat fresh vegetables or something like that. But even with I'm blanking. Fukushima? No.
Oh, the Japan, the
what's
tsunami
the name of the
earthquake. Yeah, that was Fukushima, I think.
Fukushima, yeah. Even that didn't really affect us, right? Even though it was a gigantic... So we have been sitting in this very comfortable nest and everything was fine and we were wondering and worrying about very everyday things. And so this is why I think this will be interesting for us as a generation or like the generations around us, because we've never really experienced anything like that before.
Yeah, I find it really hard to... Oh, sorry, continue.
No, it was just, we've been in the US for a year now and we weren't able to travel back to Germany, right? So it was, my mom said it at some point when I talked to her on the phone, it was, it's kind of like during these times of war when there was just these letters from the front and people couldn't come home. So we literally couldn't come home. I mean, we're fine. We have a job. We have a home. We're very safe. It was just an interesting experience not being able to go see a family or anyone. Yeah. I mean, what I find weird is that, I've been, in some sense, you could say, also quite affected by this, not only because I did a research project on it and spent a year of my life doing this thing, and also moved during a pandemic to a different city, which in this case wasn't that much of a problem, but it's still weird being in a new city and everything's closed the entire time. But in a way, I don't think I've really been affected. In a way, it's really weird that this huge thing is happening kind of around you. But I mean, number one, I'm kind of introverted, so I'm not someone who needs to go out to town every day or something, right? My life is pretty similar compared to the way it normally is. And second, also, in terms of just job security, this happened at the second year of my PhD, right? So, and I have 4 years funding, so it's pretty much guaranteed that it's going to be over by the time I have to look for a job, basically, right? So in a way, I've been really lucky in just how it fit into my life. If this had happened 2 years earlier, I would have, God knows, that was not a fun time in general. And then to have this on top of it would have made things pretty rough. But so in a way, I don't even know whether it's going to make, in terms of memory, when I would think back, let's say in 20 years about my life, I'm not sure it's going to be a huge thing. But for me personally, well, because again, I'm what I do what I do anyway. I'm at home and I read books. It's not. Yeah. I mean, of course, it has an effect, and it wasn't always easy. But I think in a way, I've been lucky that even this big thing hasn't really affected me that much. But again, I think it's more due to circumstance rather than anything else. Yeah, I have to admit, for me, it was really hard psychologically, especially in the beginning when we went on through this lockdown extremely quickly from 0 to 100 essentially, and everything was closed from one day to the other. And we would just, the US or California closed really early compared to other US states. And then all these news from New York were coming in, and Bergamo and Italy. And I remember checking all numbers every morning, different newspapers, different statistics every day, and reading different models, reading different predictions.
Yeah, I had that too, but it lasted for like a week or two. Like it was pretty much, it was basically when we were collecting the data for our study, which was mid-March to, we finished in mid-May, but basically the main work was done from like mid-March to, let's say, 3 weeks into early April. Then there was the same thing, but like outside of that.
I think, to be honest, it's still the first thing I do in the morning. I look at the R value.
Oh, really? Okay.
In the US, in Germany, in the region where my parents live, and then in California. And I always know whether it's above or below 1.
So what's it now? What's it today?
It's a little bit over 1 in Germany. It's slightly over 1, but it has been for a couple of days. And the trajectory that Germany is taking is really bad. I'm really worried.
Yeah, but it's in a way that's not surprising because the numbers are going up for the last few weeks. So
yeah,
almost, of course, it's above 1. But yeah, we'll see. I just booked train tickets to visit my family over Easter. We'll see whether I can use them. Maybe I should have waited until tomorrow because they're making some sort of decision today, but we'll see. By the way, so you mentioned you are working in Ralph Adolphs' lab. We'll get to that you spent your time doing COVID mainly this year, but what did you actually want to do? Like, what was the initial plan for going there?
The initial plan, as I said, I'm with John O'Doherty and Ralph Adolphs, and so it's 2 labs, and John O'Doherty's focus is decision making. So
just briefly, is it like equal, like half, or is it like mainly one with a bit of methods help from the other, or how exactly?
I have my office space is in the Adolphs lab, but that was just because there was more room, so it was more of a logistical decision. And also we moved to this new building and I have a beautiful view of the St. Gabriel Mountains and I'm very happy about that.
Tessa showed me, it's a very nice view.
And so, I applied with both of them last 2019. And so it is essentially half. Right now I spent more work on, in Ralph Adolphs' lab because the COVID study is run with the Adolphs' lab. But I'm in both lab meetings and participate in discussions. And essentially that was also the goal because their shared expertise is actually what is great because John is an expert in modeling of decision making and has decades of work on different forms of decision making, habit formation, all these kind of things. And then Ralph, on the other hand, is investigating social processes in healthy individuals and individuals with autism. And it's just, the combination was just great. And they have worked together a lot before. So Caltech is a really small school. And they have collaborated a lot before, and they've always had shared projects. Then there's this Conti Brain Imaging Center here, which they also acquired together. So it's not hard to collaborate here. It's you can easily talk to everyone, and that's actually, I think, a pretty great thing about Caltech is that people really collaborate a lot, and there's a lot of interaction between the different labs. And Ralph just a couple of years ago, maybe 2018, 19, I'm not sure, he published this book with David Anderson, which is actually comparing or is covering emotion processing from mice to human. So it's a huge field, and it's just I'm really happy about the collaborations. You also get in contact with a lot of people that had been at Caltech before or that just collaborated with them on other projects. And so you get a much bigger network of people that are interested in similar things, or you hear about a lot more things than I'm used to from Germany. Yeah. And especially, I mean, that was one upside of the pandemic is that you can now, I mean, the COVID project there are 7 different institutions working on that. And it's not a problem because we always meet on Zoom, right? So it doesn't really matter where you are, and you can just work from anywhere, and everyone can join. And also we have a lot more lectures and talks from outside. You can easily invite people to your lab meeting to give a talk. I mean, that actually I kind of like. And it works much better than it did before, I feel.
Yeah, I think that's also something that's been handy for the podcast. That, I mean, it's kind of coincidence, but I think it probably helped in asking people that now everyone is completely familiar with all of these things and doing it regularly. I think like if I'd asked maybe 2 years ago, I mean, obviously people used Skype and all that kind of stuff, right? Or Google Hangouts, I think was 2 years ago. But anyway, like people were using all these things, right? But you'd use it like once in a while. It wasn't this thing where you go like, oh yeah, I do this like video thing over the internet with people every day. So I think it probably also helped there in just making it more accessible for people to say, sure, I'll do the interview. But did you have a specific research project within, or was it just, Tessa, you're great, do what you want to do. We're here to help you.
I didn't have a specific research project, to be honest. So they're very flexible. And the first day I got here, we went for lunch, and Ralph said, so what do you want to do? Which is a pretty big question. And I honestly, I sat there and I was like,
That's too existential question for the first meeting.
Yeah. And, but I think he honestly meant it. It was like, so what you're interested in, what you want to do? And I was terrified. I mean, I was terrified in general because there are a lot of impressive people here, and you don't always feel like you fit in the beginning, or even now. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to continue the work that I did in my PhD to some degree. So what I did in my PhD was looking at theory of mind processes and taking a more computational approach to social inference processes. So that was still generally the plan, but it wasn't all worked out yet what I was going to do. So I pretty much actually started by reading all the grants that they had currently, they had received in the years and months before I got here, and looking at how it fits together. And then Ralph encouraged me and John encouraged me to just talk to lab members, hear what they do, see where I can collaborate with them. And it was a really interesting experience in the first 2 weeks because I could actually meet people. And then it got a little harder, but and it took me a while to find the project that is going to be my project now. And then I'm going to work on with a colleague that started a postdoc here as well. And so, but it was an interesting process, and it was actually quite fun to bounce ideas around. But it was similar to the beginning of my PhD, where there was not a clear, I wasn't hired to work on a project. It was more, okay, so let's think of something, which, as I said, is great because you can be very explorative and creative, but also it is extremely difficult and confusing in the beginning because there's so much you can do, and then it has to be exciting and novel, but also it has to be manageable, and it has to cover all these different things. And so it was, to be honest, it was quite a challenge, but now I'm really happy with what we came up with.
It also sounds like your PhD was good preparation then in terms of the big picture and figure out your own ideas, right?
Yeah, and that wasn't just my ideas, right? It was with Jan and Michael, and it was also all of us bouncing ideas around, and Jan, Martin Hebert, and so it was a good preparation in the sense of there is a lot going on, but still I feel like it's still extremely difficult, and it's the most fun and the most difficult part of academia, I think. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about doing something new, right? People can't just tell you what to do. Yeah. I think we'll talk more than maybe about what you did during your PhD and about that kind of stuff maybe a bit more later. Now, so as we mentioned, you've spent the first year basically of your postdoc doing something completely different. You already mentioned that you had these lab meetings where people would present stuff. Did it start then from there that people said I don't know, we've already done all this research into this, or how did that start?
Actually, it started with Uri Moss, who used to be a postdoc with Ralph and is now at Chapman University in Orange County. I think they had a conversation just, this is an interesting time, and it's probably going to affect biases a lot, especially in the US, or just generally anti-Asian biases. And so they just started chatting, I think, and then Ralph sent an email over the lab mailing list and said, hey, I was just chatting with Uri and we want to do something. I mean, it seems like it's a good time to do something. Who's interested? And then a couple of people responded. It was Yanting and myself in the beginning, and Damien Stanley, who's in New York and who also was a postdoc here. And because Damien has done a lot of work on implicit and explicit biases, and that's so Ralph was like, if you're doing something on biases, we should definitely call Damien. And so that's how they got Damien. And then it was like, okay, so who else is interested? And it was Yanting and myself. And then we started chatting, essentially. So we just had the Zoom call. It's like, okay, so what are we going to do? We have to be quick because it's already happening. It was, I think, mid of March. And then we started brainstorming, and we had a couple more people join. And it was a very fast and exhausting period of time. So we launched this COVID dynamic study on April 4th. And so we decided we wanted to do something longitudinal, something really longitudinal, because as I said, we looked at these projections and it was kind of clear that this thing was not going to go away soon. And a lot of things are going to happen, and this is going to be a period of extreme change and all kinds of things. And so we were sitting there and discussing, so what would potentially be relevant, and what was relevant at the time was that toilet paper and people staying at home. And so, but it was okay. So things are going to change, and we were just sitting there and trying to think about and predict what would happen in the next couple of months, over the next year. And so we focused on designing a study that would take almost a year. And of course, in the beginning, the massive problem was funding as well, because actually running a study with 1,000 people over a year, in the beginning weekly, then bi-weekly, and then later we went to a monthly schedule, is actually quite a expensive endeavor.
Yeah, that's when I presented in the lab, I was like, guys, they paid them like $10 an hour. They must have paid like $100,000 for this study or something like.
We did pay a lot. I mean, we did pay a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to say the exact figures, but I was just looking at like the data you reported. It's like, this is an expensive study.
It was an expensive study, but we also wanted, because I mean, it is a longitudinal study, right? And it was conducted over the internet. And so we also wanted people to be happy, right? We wanted them to come back. And also, I mean, it was a gigantic economic crisis, right? So a lot of people actually started doing these online studies to earn a little extra money, and you wanted to pay them fairly, right? So they got $10 an hour, and
10 hours per dollar.
Each session lasted about an hour. And we just, I mean, they were helping us with a complex project, and we really wanted them to be fine and to be happy. And later clinical psychologists joined the project as well, and people that are studying substance abuse and trauma. And so they were like, people, you have to provide some resources. I mean, these people are really depressed, as you can see from their scores, and you guys we have to provide resources for psychological help or food banks or these kind of things, because people were really struggling, and people sometimes really wrote very heartbreaking messages, our participants essentially. And so, we started this thing, and we thought, okay, let's run it on weekends, because probably the news cycle is going to pick up on Monday again. And so we wanted this period between Friday and Monday when things were a little slower and new policies had already been instantiated, and then before the new stuff happened on Monday, so that we'd be able to kind of capture things in time. But then things got really crazy in the US over the last year, and it really didn't matter whether it was the weekend or not, I feel. But that was the plan. So this is why kind of the structure of the study was to record every weekend. We gave them 48 hours to complete the study from Saturday morning till Monday morning, and they could do it whenever they had time. But we just wanted to have it in a fixed period of time. We try to sample all over the US. We try to sample more like a larger age group. But of course, there is the sampling bias. There is a massive sampling bias in running a study over the internet. And
did you consider, I mean, so you did it by a prolific. Did you consider doing it as a representative study, or was that just going to completely ruin the budget? Because it costs like 30% more or something on there, right, to do representative sampling?
No, we did sample. Actually, you can choose some criteria, right? So we tried to make it. So we actually launched it in different batches over the US so that we could cover the East, the Middle, and the West. So we try to get the same amount of participants in each area, and then we also launched it in different age brackets. So that we could cover the higher age bracket more representatively. But for example, it's extremely difficult to sample a politically representative sample, even over prolific. And I mean, the majority of prolific users are more left-leaning Democrats in the US. They're less conservative voters, and also it's a very dynamic characteristic of a person, right? Especially in a year of an election. So we couldn't really representatively sample for that. And also, other race and ethnicity was, hard to cover. So that's and also it had to be really quick. So that it was kind of like a trade-off. Okay, we either launch it today or we wait another week, get this, figure that out. So it was really just a push and pull between what can we actually do? Because we were 3 people in the beginning running this thing.
Okay. And what I meant was that on Prolific, you have the option to say that you want a representative sample according to age, gender, and ethnicity in the country. But that then doesn't include geographic, I don't think, and political, definitely not.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is also that costs then, basically Prolific then has to really organize and get the people who are between 65 and 70-year-old Asian woman or whatever, right? They have to get those people, so they cost 30% more or something.
Yeah.
But I guess you kind of did that in a more manual way then.
Yeah, we try to account for geographic location and age, and it did work to some degree. We got participants from all 50 states, and I think our oldest participant was 83.
Yeah, no, it looks pretty good. I mean, as you mentioned, you have this figure, right, about the political stuff. Yeah, half your people identify as Democrat in your study, whereas a third usually do it in the US. So it is biased in that sense. But no, the thing is also even if you have a fully representative sample according to 6 criteria, that's only going to be for the first data collection, right? And as soon as you have dropouts, it's just going to deteriorate anyway.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one question I had, in general, is or not one question, but one area I'd like to cover is the practicalities of doing this research, because you said you started with 3 people, but when you look at the paper, there's 7 people on here named, and then another 10 who aren't even named, and Ralph Adolphs is one of the people who isn't even named. He's part of the COVID dynamic team. So how did just more people find out what you were doing, or did you reach out to people, or how did kind of this team grow and develop or change?
It was very dynamic. It was a mixture of both. There are, as I said, there's people from 7 different institutions involved in this project, and it ranges. It covers cognitive science, neuroscientists, psychologists, political scientists like Mike Alvarez, for example, joined, who is, he does a lot of research on elections and political research here. And he did a huge amount of work on the election in 2019. And so, for example, it was great to get his insight and advice on the study, because he actually was the first one who was okay, yeah, I know you psychologists really don't care about what your sample looks like. Essentially, you just take whoever you can get. But no one else really accepts that. So you should really think about this, that it's mostly young, well-educated college students, essentially, that you're testing usually. Then there was Gillian Yaffe joining from Yale Law School, who got put another perspective onto this, more about the policies. And, for example, his student Caroline Lawrence manually went through all the policies in each state and collected it on like every wave. She went through this whole thing and was like, okay, what's the max number of people that can gather? Is there a mask mandate? Is there a stay-at-home order? And she collected all of this manually because at the time there was no like freely available website that was collecting all that information. And so it was a huge amount of work by a huge amount of people. Getting funding was a huge task. And Ralph spent a lot of time just trying to find the money to run this thing. And then, we had to code up all the tasks and the questionnaires and then actually monitor the study because it had to run in these 48 hours, right? And if people encountered any technical difficulties, we had to help them. So we monitored it from 7 a.m. Eastern to 10 p.m. West Coast time. So there was always someone monitoring the prolific messaging board and seeing whether people had any kind of problems. And we had like this elaborate, Damien created this really beautiful figure of how we solve technical issues. It's like this gigantic flow chart. And so
did you have many technical issues? Because, I mean, we basically did the same thing with, let's say, half the participants you had. Or, I mean, not even that. A few people messaged me here and there, but it was like 3 or 4.
It's not as much. So the questionnaires weren't a huge issue, but we also ran these tasks. And then, for example, I don't want to bash any browsers here, but some didn't work. And we had to find all of these things out in the beginning, right? And loading all the images sometimes didn't work, and some people had just like connection issues, or they were worried because there was this short period of time where they could complete it, and then they didn't have time, or they were interrupted, and they were very worried about not being able to finish it. And so they contacted us, or like all kinds of other things. So just, they wanted to clarify something, or a link wouldn't work. So it's, there are a ton of different things. And when 1,000 people at a time do it, you have to be quick to respond to these messages and keep track of it. So we became this like a customer service thing for a while.
Yeah, I mean, that is always I did have this huge, I have it in general with online studies once you put it live, because it was like, oh God, I hope I didn't mess up. Otherwise I'll get like 200 pointless responses now.
Yeah.
But it's not a problem because whatever. It's like, especially online, it was often a short study that I did before the pandemic. So, worst case scenario, I waste a bit of money, which is silly, but not that big of a deal. But with the COVID study, it really was like, if I get this wrong, then I've ruined our data collection, basically. Yeah. It's like, I better not get this wrong.
No. And of course we got things wrong, right? We had technical problems, and then we discovered bugs every once in a while. So we had to adapt it every once in a while. And of course we're only human, right? And it was, as I said, it was a very big time pressure. So of course we got things wrong, but
No fatal errors.
No fatal errors, but
like you forgot to record the participant ID or something, or
that did not happen, but other things happened.
Okay. Do you want to disclose them, or is that?
It was like forgetting to make responses first, or forgetting a question there and here, or something like this. It was like this gigantic amount of questionnaires and tasks. Or we had this one task that was actually a real interactive game because it was hard to run it. So they got feedback the next wave they returned, and then it was just difficult to make sure that they all got the correct feedback. And I, to be honest, I've never run an online study before the COVID study, so I was kind of learning as I was going. So, for example, that was one of the big technical issues, is that this feedback, for example, wouldn't load, and or for this participant wasn't there, or something like that, and we just had to make sure that everything's there.
Yeah, I made one really annoying error. It's just so stupid. It's not a problem in the end, but it was this thing where, so we had when we created the server, we had all these different questions, and sometimes we made new versions of the questions, right, just to improve it. So then when we went to that was the first data collection, then for the second data collection, I just copied the projects over, right, and we added some stuff and that kind of thing. And anyway, I was like, oh, well, I can just delete some of these old questions we're not using. because, we're not using them, and then I could confuse and accidentally put the old questions in, that kind of stuff. That turned out not to be the greatest idea that I ever had, because it turns out the way the data was recorded is that every question you have is a column, which means that even the questions you don't use are a column in your data set, which means that once you take some out, you now have the fun task of finding out which, you have to rearrange all the columns you have, which in a way is not that big of a problem because it all shifts systematically. But that was an unnecessary amount of work we had just because I, for once, tried to be tidy.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. It is. So Andy and Lynn have created these ginormous tables, because also we changed things around as we went along, and the variables changed name. And so there's a huge table that just aligns the variable names and all the different waves and all the different participants. And it's just so that all have all columns have the same. And we're still working on that. We're still working on cleaning and sorting out the data. It was... Yeah.
Do you also find that the most fun task of the entire project? Sorting data and putting a lot of time into not messing up majorly?
Yeah, that's... for me, this was the first time working in such a big group of people. As researchers, you usually have one or two collaborators that you work with on a project, right? But you don't work with 10, 20 people at a time. And that was an interesting experience. We had to change our coding habits. We had to make sure that everything's well documented. But and I learned a lot from, for example, from Lynn, who's great at organizing these kind of things and keeping structure in these things and documenting everything very perfectly and neatly. Of course, it's a very tedious job, but it was actually great to learn from other people how they do this, and also develop different strategies to how to deal with these things. And now, as I said, we're still cleaning and sorting and organizing the data. And as we go back and forth between people, you have more control. So someone creates the table and then someone else starts using it and realizes, oh, there's an issue here, or this doesn't make sense. And so I think it's actually much more controlled than when you do it by yourself, right? Because usually you code it like an analysis, for example, and no one ever goes through your code. And I'm pretty sure there are mistakes here and there. It's very unlikely that it's not. And so that was, to be honest, I really enjoyed working in this big team, especially in this time of lockdown, because it became a very tight connection, because it was always, we were always in a rush. It was always time pressure. And I think I have never said goodnight to as many colleagues, as often as I did now over Slack. I think it was actually, I learned a lot from this. And I think it's, and as I said, also from having people of different expertise in there. And for example, having a political scientist tell you a little bit about how other fields in social science do these kind of things, which I don't know how psychology and cognitive science got around not taking care of these things.
Like which things?
For example, not sampling representatively, or not weighting your data properly so that your data, your sample, is more representative. Just not looking at that.
But isn't that just, it seems to me like a lot of those things are more relevant to this research than to other research though, right? If it's something like this where your perceptions, that kind of stuff, really depend on your political affiliations, that kind of stuff, and then that makes a huge difference. But I wonder to what extent it really makes that much of a difference in most research.
When you look, for example, at social decision-making, it is something that is heavily influenced by your culture and how you grew up and how you've been socialized and educated, right?
Yeah.
There are a lot of studies on cultural differences, for example, how some societies are more individualistic and others are more collective. And I'm pretty sure that there are very different views, even between Germany and the US, and how self-dependent or independent you have to be, or how much you rely on the society and on the group. And that was actually something that I think was really interesting in the beginning of COVID, because, for example, this mask, wearing a mask and not going out is a gigantic public goods game, right? It's not fun. And especially for young people, it was this, okay, I'm probably not going to get hurt as badly. And it is a cost for myself, staying at home and not meeting other people. But if everyone behaves in the same way, like if everyone doesn't stay at home and doesn't wear a mask and still meets people, then we're all going to be heavily affected, because then the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed, and then nothing works anymore. And then when I get into a car accident or something, they can't treat me because the hospital is completely full. So it really is this question of, do I work with everyone else, hoping or expecting that everyone else is also following that strategy or that practice? Or am I just looking out for myself here? Am I looking for my own needs? And I mean, that is something really interesting, I think, about this pandemic, is how we as a society collectively behave. And also that we have these collective experiences right now. We at the same time have very similar experiences. I mean, it's very different for each and every one of us, because as you said, you're more of an introvert. You don't care. It's fine for you to sit at home and read books. And it's perfect. Don't bother me.
I haven't had to make any excuse for not wanting to go to a party in months. It's amazing.
And then there are other people who are really dependent on social context and social interaction, or as you said, we both kept our jobs. We were able to work from home, and other people lost their jobs, or they still had to go to work and be exposed to very dangerous situations. And so it's there is a similarity in how we experience this time, but there's also each individual person's experience, which is very different. But there is like this base fluctuation underlying it, which is very similar, at least within a nation maybe, or in an area. And even though we were in this period of being so separated, like socially distant, I mean, it's still a huge social psychology question, an experiment, essentially. It's like, how are we going to behave? It's this, this crazy thing about buying toilet paper. Why on earth was toilet paper sold out so quickly? And it was this massive social feedback loop. Everyone else is buying it, I need to buy it.
Yeah, that was the one thing in Germany we had. Like, there was nothing with food ever. That was, apart from like maybe 1 or 2 days when like certain food items were gone. But like toilet paper was a thing where, I mean, like even my mum said that she lives in like the countryside basically, where it's very relaxed because it's like everyone has their own house and all that kind of, like, it's just, you don't have these like dense, and also like the supermarkets, and she said, like, well, I like always just like in the cellar has like some stored goods, right? Just like in a storage room. She's like, I'm on my own. I had like toilet paper for 2 months or whatever. But then after like 4, 5, 6 weeks of just not seeing any toilet paper in the supermarket, she did go like, I'd better buy some when I get it, like when they have the opportunity. She started asking like the people in the supermarket, like, when are you guys going to get more toilet paper? Because I'm starting to get worried here too.
Yeah. Yeah, they started selling single rolls at the checkout here. So you could only take 2 rolls at a time. It was also, you could only take 2 of the same items, for example, at the same time. Like 2 loaves of bread, for example.
Milk and like that kind of stuff, yeah.
Yeah, it's... that's a massive social phenomenon, right? It's like a massive social feedback loop that was going on there.
But like one thing that really surprised me when we were talking about like differences between groups and that kind of stuff, one thing that really surprised me or maybe I should say, so I lived in Hamburg until end of November of 2020, and now in Heidelberg since December. And in Heidelberg, people, like I was in Hamburg November, and then 2 days later I was in Heidelberg. And Heidelberg, people wear masks more. I find it quite noticeable. You just go there. There was this and I think you didn't have to at the time. There's this big like shopping road basically where it's like a pedestrian center and there's like, shops everywhere. And pretty much everyone was wearing a mask there, which definitely wasn't the case in Hamburg. And what surprised me most almost is like I had it again this morning. You see these like young kids, like young lads, like 15-year-olds or whatever, outside chilling wearing a mask. Like, it really surprised me that, like, those were the last kind of people I thought who would be sticking to the restriction when no one is watching, when they're just amongst themselves. But they're completely sticking to it. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Not in Hamburg. I can tell you that.
It's interesting, right? I mean, it's not that far apart. I mean, here you can also see it at different parts of LA County, or when you drive 40 minutes, it's a completely different picture. Here, people go running with a mask, people go hiking with a mask. They're always wearing a mask, essentially. And it's become this kind of greeting thing, is that when you're walking with your mask down and then you pass someone, you automatically put it up. It's like, or other people don't put it up or don't even have it with them. So it's kind of becoming this political statement in a way to wear a mask or not wear a mask when you're outside.
In the US, yeah.
In the US, yeah. But even within California, which is considered to be very...
Right, sorry, yeah, of course, California is like 300% Democrat or something.
Actually not. So there is variability here, but it's... no, it's just, yeah, it's interesting, I think.
I mean, it's also interesting just how the norms change in terms of, you know, there's this, I definitely had this thought, and I think I saw a tweet about this as someone like, you know, whenever you see someone outside, walking around outside with a mask on, you kind of want to keep distance from them because like, oh, they've probably got something gross. But now since the pandemic, it's like, oh, they're safe. I can like always walk closer to them than to someone else. Like that, because like in Germany, no one, like you couldn't even buy masks, right? Like because it just wasn't a thing at all. I mean, I heard like, you know, some Asian countries you have it where it was fairly common, and usually people were out running around with a mask in Germany would be Asian people, right? Would be like, you'd very occasionally see someone with a mask, and it would almost always be someone from Asia because it's just a norm thing. But yeah, that's changed. That's a norm. That's just completely flipped.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that is interesting to look at. I mean, that's also part of the study to some, like one part of it is, especially Uri and, Gideon looking at this, changes and norms and behaviors. But for example, when you were just mentioning it with mostly Asian people, where it's part of, and when you're sick, you're wearing a mask, you won't get onto a subway if you have a cold without a mask kind of thing. As I said, like part of the study is also looking at implicit and explicit racial biases. I mean, especially right now, for example, there have been a lot of reports about anti-Asian crimes.
That was last week, right, or something?
Yeah, last week there was a shooting in Georgia with the majority of victims being Asian women, and it's being discussed whether it is a hate crime or... I mean, there are all kinds of questions about the motivations of the shooter, but also small. I mean, it's not just shootings, but it's also smaller events, people being insulted on the street and these kind of things. And I mean, we all have biases, and I notice in my bias that at some point, whenever when restaurants opened up again, for example, when you could sit outside, I always felt like we should go to an Asian restaurant because I trust Asian people way more to behave responsibly with respect to the pandemic because they know what they're dealing with. Asia is doing a much better job at handling the pandemic than most Western countries. I mean, it's also a bias. It's a super strong bias, but it can...
Half the people were probably born in the US.
Yeah, but it feels safer and more organized, and there's hand sanitizer on every table, and it's more structured is what I feel, but it's a super strong bias. And so I think it is interesting how that changes over time. And then also with the killing of George Floyd, that added to the dynamics of biases, I think, especially in the US. So I think when that happened, we kind of thought, okay, this is not the COVID dynamic study anymore. This is just...
Yeah, I mean, you've got so many different questions in there and so many things you're asking about. You are just, if we forget about COVID for a second, you probably are just getting a lot of data just about how all these variables change over time and how these perceptions, norms, whatever, just change. Yeah, just because of the stuff that's happening that's, let's say, largely unrelated to COVID.
Yeah, I mean, we had these questions about implicit and explicit biases towards Asian Americans. And we kind of included the question about biases towards Black people as a control condition in a way, as a comparison of also, like we had like, as a control condition to compare it to anti-Asian biases. And then this social civil rights movement
ruined your control.
I mean, it was impressive. It was impressive how long people went to the streets and how, how strongly that influenced the world and the US and then US politics. But it was just an extremely variable time. And
you've got data for everything.
We've got data for everything. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, we'll see.
Speaking about having data on everything, so one thing I really struggled with in our study is, and our study is obviously much, much smaller than yours. We have 3 time points for data. We have, I don't know, let's say there's like 20 to 30 variables or something that are like the main ones. I found it really hard to to be fair, we also tried to kind of put it in one paper and wipe one paper out of this. But that was a real struggle to that's basically what I'm finishing. Well, I would be finishing right now if we weren't talking, to really just find that, put that into one framework. So you have one paper where we can describe what we're doing in a coherent way. How on earth are you going to do that? I mean, I guess you're doing lots of studies out of this in a way. That's the answer. But how do you actually, for a binary question, have you actually already started analyzing data, or is it still organizing, sorting through?
It's a mixture of both. So as I said, this is a huge team effort, and different people contributed different questions and different ideas and different focuses on different topics, right? And so, and also the study contains well-established questionnaires, like psychological questionnaires or political questionnaires and tasks. And then there are more experimental measures that people develop just for this study kind of.
And then you have the external stuff.
And then we have the external stuff on top of that. Yeah. So, there are a bunch of people working on different projects, and we meet once a week. We have this data structure system where you have to present to the group what you want to do with the data. You have to request the data, all the variables you want. And this is not, this is kind of to make sure that everyone knows who's working on what. And there are more people joining now that the data is there, working on different projects. And we get help from statisticians, for example. But the idea behind that was to make sure that no one is just p-hacking and just looking around in the data and exploring it until they find something, but that there is a discussion beforehand and people present it, and we make sure that everything's sorted out. But there are a ton of different projects going on, and some have started analysis yet. Some are still in the exploration phase. Yeah, one paper was published on that, and that was on mask norms, and that was actually done by Carolyn Lawrence, the person that also collected all this data on policies. And she's a law student, so she was particularly interested in how these, the effect of these mask laws, because before COVID, you weren't allowed to wear a mask, right? There are, as I said, people from Rutgers looking at substance abuse. There is a huge study that Ralph and one of Ralph's grad students are working on, which isn't particularly related to COVID. It was just looking at change over time, looking at how states and traits change over time within an individual, and doing they're running simulations on that. We're looking at more I'm mostly focused on the social questions and the bias questions. And we're looking at, we're starting to analyze things there, but it's also still in the process of making sure that the data is all high quality data, that we make sure that there are no weird data points in there and everything works and everything's correct. So we're currently transitioning from this period of sorting everything to actually looking at it.
Yeah. One question I had, which is a kind of random one. So you have all these, so I'm looking right now at your table 1 where you'd say what you collected when. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm immediately contrasting this what we did. So we basically had some questions, and then each time we collected more data, we added questions, but we maintained the initial thing. Whereas in your case, it seems questions came in and out almost of the survey, and there's some that are, let's just take the humanitarian egalitarianism questionnaire, I guess, or whatever. You collected that on the first 2 data collections, then on the 5th, and then on the 7th, but not on the 8th or any in the middle. How did you? There's quite a few of these, which I kind of seem to have a regular rhythm in terms of data collection. Like, number one, why? How did you? Why was that, and how did you decide when to collect what? Yeah, maybe let's just leave that question, then I'll ask the rest later, so you don't have to remember 5 questions.
So why we selected different questions at different time points was, as I said, there were a lot of people involved, a lot of questions being asked, and one issue was just there wasn't enough time to do everything every time, because we felt like more than an hour is just too hard, too difficult on the participants, especially with all these questionnaires. It's a lot of questions, it's a lot of reading, and you don't want to tire them out too much and make it too hard on people. So that was why we didn't collect everything every time. Then another issue is a lot of these questionnaires, for example, ask about in the last 30 days, for example, or in the last 6 months. And so if you collect data every week, you don't need to repeat this questionnaire because you're asking about the last 30 days. Then, as I said, there's this one project that is specifically focusing on what is considered to be a state and what is considered to be a trait of a person. So what is something that stays stable over time, relatively stable over time, and what discriminates people from one another. And the other thing is like the state, what is that is more dynamic. It changes more over time and is more situational. And so we selected, for example, these questionnaires, which are considered to be more trait specific, looking more at trait measures. We repeatedly sampled them, but not every time. But there's more the basic question of, do these things change? Is that something that is actually stable in a person? When you look, for example, at the state trait anxiety questionnaire, where you ask about states, anxious states and anxious traits, and then the assumption will be you don't have to repeat a trait questionnaire because this is something that is stable, right? But especially right now, it could be that actually your trait anxiety changes over time, and it's a period of continuous stress over months and months at a time. And so there is the potential for things to vary, but we thought we don't have to sample it every time. And then other things. So,
and then you just went, like, say you don't have to sample it every time, then you just say, do we have time for this?
Well, I know we have a planning sheet where we have, we marked for each questionnaire, or each part, each task, what the desired frequency would be. So monthly or bi-monthly or just once, for example, like the basic big demographic questionnaire in the beginning, it was fine to do it only once. And then mostly Lynn planned what was going to be collected when, and then some things were being discussed. And we had trial runs before we started every wave, like a bunch of people went through the thing and we looked at how long does it take. And then we had to adapt maybe sometimes a little bit. And then, that stopped after maybe 10 waves or something, but we did really check it a lot in the beginning. And then also we added things as events unfolded, right? So for example, before the election, we added questions about political views and who you trust most. And then during the protests, during this big Black Lives Matter movement, there were a lot of protests all over the US. And so we added questions about that. When there were the gigantic wildfires on the West Coast, and we have a pretty big sample on the West Coast, we added questions. Have you been affected? Have you been evacuated? Have you lost anything? Do you know anyone who lost their home or something like that? And now we added questions about the vaccine rollout, right? And whether they would be willing to get the vaccine, or whether they had the option to get the vaccine, and these kind of things. So some things were fixed and stable over time because those were planned to be repeated, and then we adapted it also as events unfolded over 2020 and 2021.
God, there was one point. What did I want to say? Gone. I don't know what I wanted to say.
Maybe I'll come back to you.
Probably like at a point when we're talking about something completely different and it's no longer relevant. Yeah. we're talking about like computational modeling of social interaction. Like, by the way, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess we kind of figured it would be something like that. That it would be a kind of I mean, like you also have one question about lifetime trauma or something like that, right? Like, there's going to be questions that you don't need to ask every time. Yeah. But then, so how do you? Again, like I mean, I'm just curious now from a just practical perspective, because I found this is like our much smaller project. It's like nothing I've done before, and I don't think I'll do again. But like, okay, so you have this. I mean, as you describe in the preprint, you have this protocol of how you can get to analyze the data. Is it basically anyone who has something they want to do just comes to that meeting and says, I want to do this? Or is it kind of more clearly defined where we say almost like this is like your area, this is your area? Or it just seems like, this is just another like thing that has to be organized. Otherwise, everyone's just running around at the same time. And yeah.
I mean, it does take time, and it is complex, and it's also a different, like an interesting social interaction and experience. No, so as I said, there are some measures which are more experimental, for example, or that people specifically designed for this and put a lot of work into, and it's kind of clear that this is the people that design that have the right to use it first, essentially. But then when you want to look at a certain question and you think, oh, this could be interesting too, you present it and you ask the people that develop the tool or something like, do you want to collaborate on that? Should we work on that together? This is how it works. And then some of these questions, for example, these well-established psychological questionnaires, we just put them in there. None of us have any kind of intellectual rights regarding these questionnaires, right? So people can join it and use it. But so right now the group is the people that are involved and the people that are listed as collaborators on this project, and as people working on this project. And then the idea is, once we got a chance to look at the data ourselves in a year, to make it simply publicly available. And before that, if you want to use the data, you can always contact us and ask to collaborate on it. And then you just also have to present in this meeting. And we just want to see what your plans are, what you want to do with it. But I think it makes a lot of sense to join forces with other studies that looked at similar questions over this year. I mean, there are a ton of studies looking at psychological change over 2020. And it would be interesting to compare different samples. It would be interesting to compare different communities, and also just to increase the power, for example, or see whether we can replicate our findings in a different sample. So I think
I just remembered what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
It was about how long the questionnaire can be, because I already found an hour is quite demanding. Like, I think like one of the big things I remember doing repeatedly is like, everyone, of course we had 5 people in our paper, right? And everyone's like, why don't we collect this? Why don't we ask that thing? I'm like, no, it's already 25 minutes long. Leave me alone. We're not putting anything more into this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's really tricky to sit. But did you notice any like data quality reduction throughout the experiment or something like that?
So the way that we did it is we had a first set of questionnaires in the beginning, and then they did these decision tasks, or like these more classic trial by trial tasks. And then they repeated the second batch, or they finished the second batch of questionnaires. So we kind of split it in 2, so it wouldn't be the same thing for an hour. So they had a little bit of a break in the beginning, in the middle, where they did something else, and where they had to make decisions or rate something or something like that. We have a bunch of different quality measures that we went through. So we don't see a strong decline, within the questionnaires, I think, but also we haven't looked at that in detail, because we also changed the order of the questionnaires. So we haven't analyzed that in detail. We have the order, and we will have to look at this. But for now, we only look at the quality overall, and we do see a decline over the first couple of waves, and we also see quite a bit of attrition over the first couple of waves. And we, so when you look at the first wave, we start with, I think, 1,700 something people, and then it declines a little bit over time. And we also, for the first 5 waves, we actually excluded people. So we have like a bunch of attention questions in there. We look at the duration, if they're too fast. We look, and we also have this one question is just how likely are you to stick with this study? This is a longitudinal thing. How likely are you to come back? And if they said, I'm not, and we didn't invite them again, for example. And so those were the criteria we used to select our sample in the beginning. And then we had this pretty stable group of people that always returned and that had a pretty high quality, had high quality data. And we look at a bunch of things. For example, free response questions. Are there reasonable responses in there? Are there words in there? How many words are in there? How long are the response strings? Like in these long questionnaires, it is just all the same. I mean, you can't really detect random choice behavior, but as long as it's repetitive and you can see it. And so we include all of these things. It's not a perfect measure. And it is demanding and long, but I think, yeah. I mean, it's a trade-off, as you said.
Yeah, but wait, you just said that the data quality decreased throughout the waves, right?
No, it was just, no, it didn't decrease. It was just, in the beginning, we excluded a couple of people. So the proportion of people that had not so great quality was larger in the beginning. And so the proportion of that people decreased. Yeah. So
okay, then I misunderstood you because I thought like, wait, but your table
the quality.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I mean, it's fewer people because we have attrition, and also we excluded a bunch of people, but the proportion of people with high quality data increased over time. Yeah.
Okay. I think I want to slowly wrap up the COVID stuff, but so one of the last questions I had was about the preprint. Just what exactly was the purpose of the preprint? Is it to kind of just like give an overview and say like, this is what we're doing, so you don't have to do it in the individual papers, or? Because in a way, like I presented in the lab, and always at the end I felt like, okay, like I presented a study with no data right now. It was a bit weird.
I mean, it is kind of like a data release paper in a way, right? It is presenting the data and the potential of the data essentially. So there are no results in the paper, but I mean, it is a common thing to present data, and we just wanted to make sure that the data is really well defined, and that we provide all these additional measures and these quality checks and the weights and everything, and it's just it's more of a methodological paper in the sense saying this data is here and this is how the data was created and this is what the data can do or what you can do with the data. But it's not a classic research article in the sense of like, we collect the data and then here are the results. There are no results in there essentially besides presenting the data in itself and showing that it has good quality and that there's variance in it and that there's difference between individuals and differences within the group. Yeah, we just wanted to make sure that this is good, reasonable data, and we just wanted for people to be able to see and explore that for themselves, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it is a data release paper.
Without releasing the data right now.
Yeah, well, because it's only I mean, it's going to be released once we're finished with everything. So yeah, it is a data presentation paper essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also it does makes complete sense to do that from the perspective of just, I think, also for the authors, just to kind of have like one thing to organize like what the data is. And yeah, it makes sense. I was just curious what exactly so it's basically presenting the data for when it comes out in a year.
Yeah, and also when it's being used, what is actually the data that you're working with? When it's being used to explore specific questions, it is just there and it is reported on what we have and how it looks like. Because I think it is important, especially with such a big sample, it's important that what kind of sample are you working with and how does it compare to the general population?
So now moving towards what we could call your main research, even though it isn't right now. Kind of the last question about the COVID thing is then like, so how does that fit in with your postdoc? Like, how long do you plan on spending on the COVID research? How long is your postdoc position? Like, what are the practicalities of that?
So I'm working on both my project and the COVID study at the same time, and then there's some other things I have to work on.
Some old projects, maybe.
Some old projects, yes, we all do. And no, it's a lot. It's a lot of work. But so I'm thinking, I mean, funding is always a question, but I'm at least going to stay here another year, maybe 2 years. We'll see, funding-wise, how things go. And how does it fit in? I mean, for example, we have this altruism task, and then we have this public goods game in there. These are things, as I said, I think in the beginning, the entire COVID pandemic is a bit of a gigantic public goods game. And so it is interesting to model essentially anonymous, large-scale group interactions. It's also, for example, that's this altruism task is more, I mean, it's kind of like a dictator game, but
classic altruism, the dictators of the world.
Yeah. I mean, the question, what is altruism altogether, right? I mean, it's just for, I mean, my general research interest is social behavior, right? How do we as humans interact with other humans, and how does the behavior and the thought process of other people influence our own behavior? And this is a huge part of it. It's, for example, who has the option for altruism, essentially. I mean, you can look at altruism, but then if you're on your last dime and you can't pay your rent and you can't pay for your food, and then it's a very different question. It's like, am I willing to give 50 cents to another participant? As when you're, I don't know, you're living in a huge mansion and you really don't care about the money and you just do it for fun. And you have a lot more opportunity, for example, for altruism. And so it is.
Have you heard of Christoph Korn? I think he has a similar study.
That's an interesting person. Who's that?
I don't know. But some person who seems to have some sort of research project going on for the last few years on whether you can or cannot cooperate in a social dilemma.
Yeah, I mean, and it is very much dependent on the situation you're in and the opportunities you have. So that's how that fits with my research. And also, like, for example, biases, they do influence our behavior towards people. And I haven't really worked on that a lot, but it's not that it isn't part of social cognition, right? It is a huge part of social cognition, how we perceive people in the first moment, how we see them, these intrinsic biases that we have learned, that we were taught, how do they influence our behavior? And it's just expanding essentially this question of social cognition to a more realistic environment, a more real life environment that is not just so focused on what's going on in the lab. And I think it's been a great experience, and I think it will help to get new ideas and continue this kind of research.
But is the public goods games that the data that you collected as part of the COVID study, is that like standard public good game, or is it like, did you change something about it to make it more applicable, or?
No, it is pretty standard public goods game. It's just that it's essentially anonymous because the groups are randomly selected on each wave, so they can't really learn anything about their partners, because you kind of learn more about the entire group, essentially, the group behavior. But it is classic standard public goods game, and they know the other players are the other participants. Yeah. And I got an email once from a participant saying, why are people not investing? This is so stupid. And then calculating, like giving me all the calculations about it. And it's like, are these actually real people? Because this is very irrational behavior. And that was a great message.
I mean, that's in the very first Prisoner's Dilemma, right? There's this by Flood where he has at the end the comments, and the second person keeps saying, like, come on. I'm like, doesn't he realize that this is the more rational thing to do? I'll cooperate a few times so he'll get it. And they're like, oh, he really doesn't get it. Like, what's wrong with him?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it also makes it easier if you then like didn't have a predefined project per se. that you like definitely wanted to work through at Caltech or something, right? Like if you're interested in like social interactions and dynamics, then you are in a sense doing that. It's just somehow for me, it seemed like you, maybe just because of what you did in Hamburg, that's just not the direction you planned to go when you arrived.
No, but I mean, I'm kind of expanding the direction a little bit, and also with the project that I'm working on now is, what I did during my PhD was a very specific work, right? It was very specific on how can we model very rational theory of mind processes, or what's rational is a bad word. I think it's a very structured and strategic theory of mind processes, essentially. So it's a very specific part of theory of mind and social interaction that we're looking at in these economic games, or in these very structured interactions when we explore that. And so I think it's actually, it follows from that to expand it a little more into what are the alternatives that, it is modeling and it is capturing a part of social behavior, a very specific part, but it's social interaction, social behavior is very broad and very big, and there are very different options to do it and engage in it. And if we want to predict and explain human behavior, we have to look at more aspects.
Okay, shall we look at the old aspects though?
Let's look at the old aspects.
That was a good
I'm not saying that it's less important. It's not. I'm not saying that it's not important and that I don't enjoy this work. I'm just saying that it's part of a broader approach.
Yeah, of course. It's one approach to studying a type of behavior or phenomenon or whatever. It's not the only approach, although it's a pretty good approach.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe if you remember, can you give a 1 to 2 minute summary of the paper?
Of the review paper?
Of your Neuropsychologia paper, Theory of Mind and Decision Science Towards the Topology of Tasks and Computational Models by Rusch et al.
It is a paper reviewing different kinds of computational cognitive models for social decision making. And as I said before, it's looking at very structured social interactions that are often studied at the interaction between economics and cognitive neuroscience, that are inspired a lot by economic research. Some are more from psychology, some are from economics, and we're looking at this intersection essentially where these two things come together, which study similar questions with very, very different approaches. And it has grown together more and more over the last years. I think that methods have been shared and approaches have been shared. And so, as I said, it looks at different computational cognitive models. So formalizations, thank you, of these kind of interactions. How can we quantify social interactions or social strategic interactions? And theory of mind generally is referred to the process of inferring other people's mental states, although even this term is very differently used by different people in different fields. But it's a term from social psychology, developmental psychology. The question is to what degree can these different computational models capture these theory of mind processes, and also in which lab tasks, in which lab environments and settings are such inference processes about other people's mental states actually elicited, which is not a trivial thing, I think.
Yeah, that's something I have a few questions about later. And then you also have you also have these two dimensions according to which you...
we're trying to characterize tasks and computational models according to two dimensions, as you said. One is uncertainty and distribution of information among individuals. And the other one is kind of interactivity to some degree. So how relevant is the behavior of other agents, as it is called in decision neuroscience, or in decision science, affected by your own behavior? How much are you affected by the other person's behavior? So how interactive is this essentially. And how, so for the tasks, it's like, what is this task? Does it have this component or this characteristic? And for the models, it's more, can it capture this component or characteristic?
What exactly was the motivation behind this sorting it, or like having these two dimensions and using that to kind of structure tasks and models?
That is, I mean, this is actually from when we developed the task for my PhD. And because we were starting out with, okay, we want to look at theory of mind processes in an interactive setting, and we want to look at how actually the neural signal between two interacting partners interaction is influenced, and so really look at interactive theory of mind processes. And then we sat there and we looked at different tasks, these classic economic games, and other tasks, and we realized that we weren't quite happy with it, because we thought it doesn't really, I mean, there's a huge possibility that it doesn't really elicit these kind of mental processes, because there are other far easier options to solve these tasks. And so actually that was an email that I still have saved on my desktop as a note from Martin Hebert, who at the time was a postdoc with Jan. And he wrote me this email and was like, okay, here are these criteria for which I think what elicits theory of mind is. And I think you have to have, it has to be, I mean, obviously it has to be interactive. Otherwise, this is something that we realized very on. It's like, if there's no behavioral relevance, then yeah, what the other person does is irrelevant to you. And so it has to be interactive. And then the second part was, your belief or your state of representation of the world has to be different from the other person's representation or of the state of the environment, because otherwise you can't discriminate them experimentally. So if they're identical, you might as well think about what the other person's mental state is. But if it is identical to your own mental state, then you as an experimenter can't discriminate between these two things because they're identical. So how would you discriminate between the two? And that is kind of how it started out. And then we started thinking about which environment and which situation would actually create such a scenario, or in the real world, where is this the case? Where do you have, for example, asymmetric information, or you have uncertainty? There are multiple possibilities for what you're currently thinking about the environment, or what kind of information you have about the environment, what it is that is driving your behavior, and where you're interacting with another person. And that's how these two dimensions essentially came along, because we think the more interactive, the more behavioral relevance there is, the stronger you start engaging in these thinking about what does the other person think, and potentially how am I being perceived by the other person? How does my behavior influence the other person? And then if you're very good at this kind of recursive reasoning and could go even further in the sense of I think that you think that I think, there's actually a very funny Friends scene where it's about two of them having an affair and the others don't know, and there's this scene where it's like, they know that we know, and it's like, but they don't know that we know that they know, and then it goes on and on and on like this. So yeah, and
so that's where you got your inspiration for
Friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
Solved that problem with that question.
Yeah, it's a very intellectual journey. Yeah, so that was the motivation for that. And so that's how we developed this, and how we looked at these different computational models to think about how we can capture that and quantify that. And we came to this conclusion that you have to have these certain criteria to make sure it's not that there's no theory of mind elicited in these other situations. I have no idea whether it is. It could be, and it could be different for different people, but just the likelihood or the probability that it happens is larger in such an environment because there is relevance of it. The other person's mental state has relevance for you, and the other person's behavior has relevance for you.
Okay, that's slightly changed. Yeah, it changes a little bit how I understood it then. Okay, so it is also a part, like, as an experimenter, what can you actually get out of this task in that sense? Not just from what does a person do, but like what can I infer from what they do?
It is an assumption of ours that this is stronger in these situations. I mean, for us, it makes more sense that people would engage in this kind of thinking in certain situations. But in the end, this is an empirical question, right? I mean, we can make all kinds of assumptions about how humans reason about things, and we can, from introspection, we get certain information, but this is just ourselves, right? So we're assuming that certain scenarios are more likely to elicit these kind of reasoning processes. But as I said, in the end, it is an empirical question.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, can I be slightly critical of some things in the paper?
Sure, go ahead.
So one thing is, you said earlier that you need interactivity to have theory of mind of these tasks. And you talked about behavioral relevance, like because of behavioral relevance, basically. If it doesn't matter to me, then what? But to me, those are just not the same thing, right? So for example, you have the two of the examples you give are, one is the false belief task, and the other are dyadic games like the prisoner's dilemma or stack hunt or whatever. And it seems to me that, according to figure 4, where you basically, you list them, right? And I think the idea is that kind of the more towards the right and up they are, the more likely the more they are, the more uncertain they are, and the more interactive they are, the more likely they are to elicit theory of mind in the participants. But it seems to me that, for example, a prisoner's dilemma can very easily lead to a lot less theory of mind than a false belief task, even though it's more interactive. Because, so in the false belief task, it seems to me that, or rather, it seems to me a lot about the number of options, like to the almost action space or belief space of someone. So like if you have a false belief task and the other person can have there's 6 different things they could believe, right? Then I have to figure out, okay, is it that option or not? Why would it be this option or not? And all this kind of stuff. Whereas in a prisoner's dilemma, it's a binary decision. It's much, much simpler in that sense. Mm-hmm. The complexity of the situation is much reduced. So it seems to me that those examples, even the examples you give, to me almost point towards the opposite of what you're trying to do, in terms of, rather that I would almost think that they are reversed in terms of how much theory of mind they elicit, if that makes sense.
So first, it's not necessarily that it elicits more theory of mind. So this, I think it's the y-axis is more about interactivity, so about this recursive reasoning, essentially. And so I would agree that, I mean, what you're actually saying is action uncertainty. You don't know what the other person's going to do, and there is a lot of uncertainty about what the other person's going to do. So there's not much state uncertainty, but there's a lot of action uncertainty potentially, or maybe there's even more state uncertainty. And I would agree that if there is more uncertainty, it would elicit, it has the potential to elicit more reasoning about the other person. But on the other hand, if it's completely irrelevant to you, then why would you think about it?
But you could make a false belief task relevant, right, by saying you get a euro every time you get it correct or whatever, right? And then,
for example, yeah, that's true. But then you would still, your prediction of the other person would be completely inconsequential of to the person that you're predicting. So this is kind of what we thought with this recursive process is, if my behavior, if my prediction of the person that has the false belief, for example, is correct or incorrect, that is completely irrelevant to the person engaging in this task, making the decision, essentially, because they don't know what kind of prediction we're making. On the other hand, if you would say that this is your opponent or this is your partner or something, and if he or she predicts correctly or incorrectly what you're doing, then you get a prize or something like that, or you will find each other in the museum where you're looking for each other and you know where the other person's going or something like that. Or only if you reach the goal together, you can open the gigantic chest box and get the prize and the pot of gold or something. Then there's this interactive behavioral relevance, essentially. On the other hand, if you have a lot of uncertainty and the other person's behavior is completely irrelevant to you, let's say you're in a supermarket and there's another person going shopping, there are thousands of choices, but you usually don't walk, or at least, I don't know, maybe you do. I usually don't walk behind people and be like, I think that person's going to grab that apple and that.
You should do it, Tess. That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's
especially
just,
during COVID, walking closely behind people.
Oh yeah, and that's not creepy at all.
Nope.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of options for social interaction and a lot of options for social inference, but I think, yeah, if the other person's behavior is not relevant to you, then it's just an energetic question, essentially. Why should you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I agree then with the with what you just said and the overall framing, but maybe not precisely the examples given, or I don't know the false belief task enough. I don't know.
I mean, the false belief task essentially, as it is classically, is you see a story, you read a story about someone doing something, and then you have to predict what that person's going to do. And it's essentially the person left the room and something changed, and so the person has a false belief, and now you have to predict that person's behavior based on that other person's belief, essentially. But it's a completely passive task.
Maybe it's to me that it just seems more open-ended in terms of like, where are they looking? And okay, if it's like very, very minimalistic, you only have two options, then it's binary also. But it just seems to me like the where they're looking, again, that just elicits way more than if I'm doing a prisoner's dilemma and the other person defected for the fifth time in a row.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And that's why I think, for example, the prisoner's dilemma doesn't have a lot of uncertainty. It's pretty clear, depending on how you frame it or like who you interact with. Let's say you interact with very different people. Then you again have uncertainty about the motivation of the other person. But if you play a prisoner's dilemma 1,000 times with the same person, I'm pretty sure that you're gonna develop some sort of heuristic. We're gonna press the same button over and over again, and there's a strong learning effect. Yeah. Maybe the figure isn't very good at making that clear. It was a bit of a difficult characterization of putting it in this two-dimensional space, essentially. But no, I agree. We should have probably made that clearer.
Yeah, I mean, especially because I've been doing basically for the first year of my PhD, I thought a lot about the prisoner's dilemma and used it. So maybe I'm focusing a bit too much on that, but I will.
Yeah.
But for there, especially, it seemed to me that, so there were like a few things. I mean, like you said, like when you have lots of iterations with one person, it tends to become fairly obvious what the next person's going to do. And in some of the iterated prisoner's dilemmas we had, I mean, the first thing is reciprocity is just super high. It's a very strong correlation. People pretty much will cooperate as much as the other person will. And you often have people who, basically reach a stable state of mutual cooperation, mutual affection. There's some variance, but it's pretty common. But the other thing I was really thinking about here with theory of mind and the prisoner's dilemma is that, and this is something I feel like maybe I missed it, but it seems to me that's missing from the discussion in the paper, is just in general the idea of heuristics. Because it seems to me, I mean, this is also a general thing for life. One can completely agonize over what someone might be thinking all the time, or you go, well, let's do that thing and see what happens. And it's in the prisoner's dilemma, it's much stronger that, right? Like tit for tat, basically. You just do whatever the other person did. In the long run, no one's going to really do better than you, and you don't have to think at all about what the other person's thinking, right? It's almost like a non-theory of mind task to me. Yeah, I don't know whether I have a specific question here, other than wanting to. I felt the need to say that.
No, I agree. And there is a huge amount of research on that, right? As you were saying, and a lot of that research includes your own work.
Not that big a proportion. You made it sound like I've been doing a lot of research here relative to the rest of humanity.
Great Benjamin Kuper-Smith and the Prisoner's Dilemma. It's pretty much the Kuper-Smith dilemma. Yeah, I agree. And so, for example, some of these computational models include that to some degree. For example, a fictitious play model essentially counts the choices the other person made previously. So it's just taking the frequency of the other person's action and predicts the next action based on the frequency of previous actions. And there's absolutely no inference process there. The only thing is like, what are you going to do if the other person's going to do this? But for the prediction part, you make no inference about the other person. And yeah, tit for tat definitely should have been in there. Win, stay, lose, shift, for example, all these things. But we didn't focus on these models there because, I mean, they never claim to involve any kind of theory of mind process, right? They're not claiming to capture.
I mean, they're acognitive theories, right?
They are cognitive theories, but they're not focused.
No,
on
I mean they are
mind.
acognitive.
Like
if you have evolutionary simulations, it's about something that doesn't even think, right? They just have a certain reflex, you could almost say, yeah.
Yeah. So, so this is why we, for example, that's why we included the the fictitious play model, for example, because it has been used a lot, but it doesn't make any assumption about what drives the other person's decision-making process.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's one reason that I'm, like in my own stuff, I'm wondering like how much I'm going to use these 2x2 games. Because in a way, the information you get out of it is very
limited,
sparse. Yeah. I mean, I still find it interesting because it's binary, that has a certain neatness to it rather than if you have like complex data. But yeah, it is kind of limiting in terms of what you can actually really get out of it. Well,
I mean, it's always a trade-off, right? If you have more freely interacting people, you probably get richer social interactions, and the inference processes are much richer. But then on the other hand, is how do you quantify that? It's after all, it's this private cognitive process that you have no way of accessing unless the person tells you what they were thinking, and then you're making the assumption that the person themselves has this access to their own cognitive process, and they are able to vocalize it, and which is, it captures a part of this cognitive process, but it doesn't capture all of it, probably. And so, I mean, this is I guess where these decision models are handy, is because it gives you some sort of quantification. It makes it measurable, comparable. But of course, it is very limited, and especially as you get into larger state spaces or larger action spaces, they become very hard to compute, and it's becoming very messy. And then the question again is that what humans are doing? Are we following this complex Bayesian learning process and updating process, or is it something else? And is this just approximating it? Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing I found kind of curious while reading your paper. I can't remember where I wrote it, but somewhere I wrote in the margins, like, this is almost like assuming the Homo economicus, but from a psychological perspective, like all this inferential process is going on rather than someone saying, whatever, I'll just do that.
Yeah.
Like, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And I mean, even just introspectively, like, think about it. When are you really thinking about another person's mental state?
Not enough.
Or
so I'm told.
No, but in most times you make very heuristic and fixed decisions. Like, I mean, I find always this example when you're passing someone in the hallway, and usually everyone goes to the right, and then, but sometimes there's this weird situation where everyone goes back and forth, and this is a clear sign of, okay, the norm somehow didn't work here, and we're stuck in this weird situation where you don't think where you go, and you don't think about it. Will the other person take the left or the right? You will just do something.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like also in like introspective real life, like even if you think about what someone's doing, you have like 3 or 4 factors you consider, right? Like that's the most. You go like, okay, were they like in a general good mood or whatever? How do they usually, whatever? Like, it's not like this super complex reasoning that really goes on. I mean, I guess maybe some people say that that's kind of what emotions are. This kind of integration of lots and lots of different influences, but at least on the cognitive level or the conscious level, yeah, I think it's heuristics all the way.
Yeah, it's emotion and memory. I mean, you have for the most people, you have interacted with them a couple of times, and you had previous experiences that probably weighted in to different degrees. Some were very influential of your image of that person. And so you have met a lot of other people, and you can maybe you can make some kind of comparison between people and like likely behavior that these people are going to exhibit. Yeah, but as I said, I mean, the social interactions are so diverse and so different, and we're probably not using the same process in every situation. But when you think about like really these really economic games, like when you're on the stock market, or when you're really playing poker with someone, and you're thinking about whether they're actually have good cards or not, and whether they're just bluffing, then you're really trying maybe to think about this. But it's probably very specific situations where the stakes are high, and where you have a strong drive to do that.
Yeah, that's another thing I wrote down. Your third dimension could be just stake size.
Yeah.
Because that's really, like, even in a prisoner's dilemma, right? Like, if you're doing lots of tasks and you earn like €1 or 10 or whatever, people will probably not think about it as much as if you say, like, there's this, I mean, like, Richard Thaler has like some of these papers where they look at game shows, right? Like, those people are probably thinking about this quite a bit when it's like $300,000 or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we probably would get very different results if you'd be like, okay, now you're playing for $50,000. What is the other person going to do?
Well, I mean, cognitively, you'll probably get different things, but I don't know in terms of behavior. I mean, there are some studies that look at stake size, and it seems to be, I think people are a bit more idealistic. Sorry, wrong, that was hypothetical stuff. I think people behave a little more traditionally economically rational. The more money is at stake, but not that much, I think.
Well, but I mean,
but the thought process going into it might be quite different.
Yeah, and it could be again, where are you? What's your action space in the sense of how much money do you have? What's your life situation in a way? Can you afford to share, or can you not? Or are you used to not sharing and all these kind of things? I mean, people make decisions in very different situations. And I think the context in which a decision is made is not irrelevant.
I mean, it's basically everything there is, right? Even if you have personality stuff. I think like I've been thinking about that a bit. Like when you look about like what influences how someone makes a decision, you have the environmental factors and the kind of more personal factors. But it seems to me in many cases, the environmental factors are just outnumber the personal quite a bit. And maybe the personal ones are, unless like anything's too extreme, like unless like it's about huge amounts of money or the differences are huge between options or whatever. I think like if everything's kind of similar, then the personal stuff is probably more important, like piece by piece compared to environmental stuff maybe. But I think there's just so many environmental factors that like accumulation of it just, yeah.
I think there's this one paper that looks, for example, at inequity aversion and guilt aversion or something. So where you have the option to the other person knowing that you didn't share, or the other person doesn't know. And then, I mean, it's a very different incentive in a way. The other person thinks you're fair, but you're actually keeping quite a lot of the money. Or do
you remember what that paper is?
I think it's Nature Communications, Van Baar et al., I think.
Okay. I'll have a look. Yeah, I might actually talk to someone soon who does inequality aversion in animals. I don't want to name the name because we haven't scheduled anything yet, but the person said yes, but that would be fun.
Oh yeah, it would be cool. Sounds interesting.
I don't know whether animals have guilt aversion. I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, it's just weird. Like in general, like when I think I wrote this to you in my email when I asked you whether you want to do this. Like I've basically not been thinking about theory of mind at all. And I've been working on, Prison's Dilemma, that kind of stuff for a year now. And somehow it's this weird thing that in some sense seems super important. And, as you said, like one of how we spend a large part of our lives, right, thinking about what other people are thinking. But in a way also, you can also manage without it pretty well in many situations.
Yeah.
I think I've run through my points.
Okay.
And I think you also might want a slight break before your next meeting.
It's okay. That's what we do nowadays. Sit in front of our screen. Talk to people.
Okay, I'll just stop recording you. Or do you have anything you want to say? Any declarations to make? I don't know.
Final words of wisdom. No.
Yeah, exactly. Something you've learned and that you think people should know.
Oh, no, I'm not going to claim to have any kind of knowledge that everyone should know.
Okay, is that your knowledge then? Everyone has their own piece of important knowledge? Or...
Yeah, no. Sorry, there's no grand statement.
No wisdom from Tessa. Okay, then I'll stop recording.